Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes in Black Women in America by Melissa V. Harris Perry. We are on page 43 and we're beginning a new theme entitled Black Women's Crooked Room. Eliza Galley was a free black woman living in Pittsburgh, Virginia before the Civil War. She was divorced, owned property, and had financial resources that made her unusual among free blacks in the Confederate South. In 1853, Galley was arrested and charged with stealing cabbages from a white man's garden. Autonomous and assertive, she could afford to fight back against the scurrilous claim. She employed several aggressive attorneys who argued her case, but a Southern, white, male legal system declared her guilty and sentenced her to be publicly whipped on her bare back. Historian Suzanne Lepsock reminds us, quote, "She was helpless in the end, the victim of the kind of deliberate humiliation that for most of us is past imagining," end quote. In 2002, historian Shauna Kai Lee, not 40 years old, was a tenured professor at the University of Virginia and the author of an award-winning biography of civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer. Complications from lupus caused 2 severe strokes within a week. Though she was left with disabled speech and diminished physical capacities, her department chair insisted that to keep her job, Lee must immediately return to the classroom. Her physician wrote multiple letters explaining the severity of Lee's condition, but she was pressured to resume teaching because, quote, "the state is concerned about sick leave abuse," end quote. Reflecting on the humiliating and physically impossible task of addressing a large classroom only weeks after a stroke, Lee saw herself as victimized by familiar stereotypes about black women. Quote, "Images of a welfare cheat kept playing in my head. PhD or no PhD, tenure or no tenure, I was just like the rest of those lazy black folks. I'd do anything for a cheap ride. I'd take advantage of any situation. I'd exaggerate and manipulate good, responsible white folks who play by the rules, all to avoid my responsibilities," end quote. Lee's stroke and its humiliating aftermath occurred more than 150 years after Eliza Galley was publicly flogged for supposedly stealing a white man's cabbage. The country was a profoundly different place in 2002 from what it was in 1853. Black women are no longer enslaved, and they enjoy the constitutional assurance of full citizenship. Centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and achievement have altered basic economic, political, and social realities for black women in vast and meaningful ways. Being required to limp and slur in front of dozens of college students is horrifying, but it is not the same as being publicly whipped. Lee was forced by economic necessity to return to work. Galley lived in fear of racial murder against which there was no reasonable protection in the United States in 1853. Their experiences are not the same. Yet there is a thin but tenacious thread connecting Galley to Lee. Each is a woman of relative economic privilege and freedom. Powerful white institutions subjected both to public humiliation and physical suffering. As a historian, Shauna Kai Lee interprets her experience of punishment as resulting from the practice of stereotyping black women as welfare cheats. The jurors in antebellum Petersburg, Virginia, were willing to convict Galley in part because they believed black women to be dishonest and criminal, willing to steal white men's property, even if they owned their own. Hold on, let me get something to drink real quick. The two women are linked across centuries of change by a powerful web of myth that punishes individual black women based on assumptions about the group. Their stories are painfully familiar to many African American women who feel that they continue to be mistreated and humiliated as a result of lies told and widely accepted about black women as a group. They force us to consider how and why American governments, American popular culture, and even black communities have contributed to the humiliation of African American women. Their experiences also lead us to ask what resources black women use for psychic self-defense and how successful they are. Although historical myths are seldom imported wholesale into the contemporary era, they are meaningfully connected to 21st century portrayals of black women in public discourse. African American women who exercise their citizenship must also try to manage the negative expectations born of this powerful mythology. Like all citizens, they use politics to lay claim to resources and express public preferences. But sister politics is also about challenging negative images, managing degradation, and resisting or accommodating humiliating public repressions. Public representations, Statistics reveal the inequality that marks black women's lives. In the United States today, more than 1 in 4 black women lives in poverty, a rate more than double that of white women. Babies born to black women are 2.5 times more likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. Compared to white women, black women are significantly more likely to be the sole wage earner in their household, to never marry, to suffer divorce, or to be widowed young, and therefore to have to raise their children without a husband's emotional or financial assistance. Black women heads of households are twice as likely to live in inadequate housing, and they earn 33 to 50% of what their male counterparts earn. Fewer than 30% of black women have bachelor degrees, and the unemployment rate for black women is more than double that for white women. Black women have rates of hypertension and diabetes that are higher than white women. They are more likely to die of breast cancer and more likely to have a hysterectomy. While HIV/AIDS infections have declined throughout the United States, the highest rate of new cases is among young black women, in whom it is also the leading cause of death. Although a much larger number of black men are incarcerated, African American women are the fastest growing population of new inmates. Nearly a third of black girls and women are sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. Most of these assaults are perpetrated by black men. On the whole, black women have less education and higher rates of underemployment, poverty, disease, and isolation than white women. Okay, let's take a second to reflect there. That's a lot to take in. One of the things that I usually do as I go through and read is highlight passages that are important. And I think that what I want to start doing here is adding maybe like a segment on or a portion on where when we read certain sentences or paragraphs or statements, saying this is highlight worthy, and me taking the time of even highlighting it in the copy that I'm reading. Just trying to do more things as I get more comfortable with the podcast, which I think is something that naturally, sort of organically happens. And so we're going to start trying to introduce this segment. I got my highlighter here with me, and I'm going to, I just dropped the book. Okay. All right, hold on one second. All right, so I think we were on page like 46. Yes, we're on page 46. And that whole paragraph that we just read through with all of those statistics, I think is important to highlight. I think that statistics are important to highlight when you're reading pieces of literature about police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And this highlighter is broke. So I'm going to leave a little. Sorry, man. I'm moving this mic around. We got to figure out. I need to get another mic. But, okay. So, right here where it says, statistics reveal the inequality that marks black women's lives. I'm just going to put a little notation here that means I need to highlight that. And sometimes I think that what I have learned in reading through these different pieces of literature, for not only for Rockford Reading, but just in the last 2 years of my life, where I've been very focused on reading, conscious about reading books that have connections to police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, I found that when people explain to you the histories of stereotypes or the histories of discrimination, the histories of oppression, the histories of exploitation, and give you historical references for it, explain to you how it psychologically affects the whatever group or community they're speaking about. And then when it does a good job of sort of painting the picture for you. But what I think lends to assisting that even more heavily is when the numbers are laid out for you, when statistics are laid out for you, because it forces you to ask questions as to why these numbers exist, as to why these statistics exist. And those questions, the answers to them usually lie back into what you read about the history of the discrimination or the history of the oppression, the history of exploitation. And so us as a community, as a podcast network community, any people who've been listening to the Rockford Reading podcast or who will listen to it in the future, when we hear these statistics, we can understand some of the root causes to them because we've read about them. We've read about the inadequate housing situation that exists that black women live in. We've read about the dangers of these communities that have extreme amounts of violence for black women. We've read about the discrimination in employment for black women. We've read about a litany list of things that specifically that generally affect black people, which means that it also specifically affects black women. And so we can understand why there is some of these numbers exist in the manner in which they exist. And I think that that's one of the important things to be able to articulate is that sometimes people want an overnight solution to some of these issues and an overnight solution to some of these problems, these situations. And the truth is that there can be no overnight solution to some of these problems and these issues, because in order to solve the problem or issue, you have to have a understanding of the problem or the issue, which means tracing back the beginning of the problem, the beginning of the issue to where it currently sits. And that is a process. That's not an overnight process. That's not a summer process or, a seasonal process. That's a everyday consciously taking some step to get more information. I'm within 2 years of being involved in this process. There's still things that I'm continuing to learn, and I'm still continuing to evolve. And that's part of what I think is called for when we are speaking about breaking generational cycles of stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination and oppression and exploitation. Part of what's called for is understanding that you'll never be finished. You'll never be done. There'll never be a day where you wake up and it's like, okay, I've done my part in being anti-racist or anti-misogynist or anti-homophobic or anti-transphobic. There's no moment when this is or anti anything that is negatively impacting us as a society. You don't wake up one day and it's over with. It's something that you commit to permanently, and it becomes a walk of life. And again, I just say all those things to say that those numbers are aided for us specifically to read and help. We specifically can understand what those numbers mean and how those numbers got there because of other pieces of literature that we've read up to this point. And the stories, neither of these stories had I heard before. The story of Eliza Galley and the story of Chena Kylie. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But I think what stands out about those stories to me is I remember Antar, who comes down here, and I'll have a Rockford reading where me and Antar read a book together. He always talks to me about how when Ida B. Wells went back and researched the cause for lynchings and the history of lynchings, the roots of where lynchings in this country lied, one of the things she found was a commonality is that black people who were successful, black people who were exceptional, black people who displayed excellence were the black people who were a lot of times most susceptible to lynchings. That it wasn't about killing and lynching black people who were doing negative things or who were raping or who were stealing. No, it was a lot of times about killing black people who these white racists in these cities and these areas felt was doing too well, was doing too exceptional. And so when I'm trying to see, is this the batteries? No, I think it's just this bus. Okay, my fault, y'all. So when I read the story about the woman who was whipped, excuse me. Yeah, that was that bus, sorry. Eliza Galley. So when I read about Eliza Galley and how she owned these things and how she, she didn't need to steal, that's what came to mind. And then again, when I read about Chana Kai Lee, excuse me, what comes to mind is the story that we read about the Harvard professor. I can't remember. I think it's Henry Louis Gates, who we read about in, I think, Have Black Lives Ever Mattered and in Race Matters, who was pulled over by police when he was walking into his home because somebody called the police because they didn't think he lived there, and he ended up getting arrested. And this was a man who was successful and a part of what you would probably consider the black elites, and he could not escape racism. He could not escape discrimination. And so one of the things that we have consistently learned here and read here is how capitalism and racism work together, and so there's not enough money that you can get to escape. There's not enough money a black woman can get to escape the shame and stereotypes that stigmatize black women in America because of how these systems are set up. And I think that one of the things that it is good for also, the same way those numbers complement things that we've read before, so do these stories. The more you read these stories, the more you can connect stories to each other, the more you can see how they're intertwined. Like Melissa V. Harris Perry is saying with the two stories that we read about, even though they're 150 years apart, you can see how you can see the connections within them. These statistical inequalities do not adequately capture black women's lives. Sisters are more than the sum of their relative disadvantages. They are active agents who craft meaning out of their circumstances and do so in complicated and diverse ways. Despite important commonalities, all African American women do not share the same ideas, beliefs, and feelings. Some join churches where they find community, opportunities to use their skills, and venues to showcase their talents. Some stay home with their kids and seek out friendship and book clubs. Some are professional working moms who drop the kids at Jack and Jill, then go to their African dance class. Some are poor urban teenagers who know all the words of every hip-hop CD released in the past decade. Some are in committed same-sex relationships and actively fighting for the legal right to marry, and others are desperately trying to get out of abusive marriages. Some are healthy, fit, and strong. Others are battling injury, disease, or addiction. Statistics show that race and gender strongly determine life opportunities for black women. On the other hand, the inherent variety among individual black women's lives sometimes reinforces, sometimes defies, and always complicates the simple story of the numbers. Still, I want to think about black women as a meaningful analytic category. Even if there is no single, universal black female experience, there are enough shared identities, beliefs, and experiences to offer insight into African American women as a group. Understanding the connection between black women's emotional lives and their politics is difficult because emotional experiences are very intimate. Emotions are so closely linked to individual temperament and experience that it is foolish to make sweeping generalizations based on race and gender. If black women as a group are more likely to be poor and unhealthy, this does not mean that all sisters are sad or angry. How African American women feel about their lives and circumstances depends on the meanings they give to them. But those meanings are often socially constructed. Social ideas like race, gender, and class have a powerful effect on personal feelings. A good example is African American aptitudes towards doctors, medicines, and healthcare. In Medical Apartheid, journalist Harriet Washington painstakingly links contemporary black reticence about the American medical establishment to a long and grotesque history of racist experimentation, abuse, and deceit. She begins with descriptions of antebellum gynecological, excuse me, that's rough. She begins with descriptions of antebellum gynecological experimentation carried out on unwilling female slaves, discusses the pervasive practices of robbing cemeteries to procure black bodies for medical school anatomy classes, recounts the appalling Tuskegee experiment that allowed black men to suffer and die from untreated syphilis, and reveals how contemporary racial assumptions affect the medical care black patients receive. Washington's book challenges the pervasive belief that African Americans' suspicion of doctors and hospitals and their notorious noncompliance with prescribed medical treatments have no rational basis. If we look at these behaviors through the conventional lens of heroic medical history, then African Americans seem unreasonably apprehensive. When we look through the lens offered by Washington, there is a clear and reasonable link between historical abuses by doctors, black oral traditions that bear witness to these horrors, community beliefs that formed as a result, individual emotions of fear, anger, and distrust in response to these beliefs, and behavior patterns of black patients reflecting this distrust. Just as medical abuse affects black attitudes toward healthcare, political and social events influence emotions, and emotions affect how we engage in politics. To understand black women as political actors, we must explore how intersecting disadvantages based on race, gender, class, and sexuality influence how these women feel and think. By politics, I do not mean exclusively or even primarily voting choices. Electoral participation is important, but politics is much broader. I want to know what obstacles black women see as most onerous in their lives and where they place the responsibility for both creating and removing these obstacles. Under what circumstances do they blame themselves when things go wrong, and when do they implicate a larger system of racial and sexual bias? When do they advocate individual, communal, or political strategies for addressing their concerns? Do they feel that black men or women of other races are allies in these struggles? The answers to these questions connect political realities to socially influenced private emotions. One connection is through political and emotional responses to common negative stereotypes. Scholars of black women's experience in the United States have highlighted the role of images and myth in creating the powerful ideologies that supported economic and social structures like slavery and Jim Crow. Hateful stereotypes are the tools that build the crooked room. They have tangible consequences when policymakers, acting on assumptions informed by these myths, make choices that disproportionately affect black women's lives. For instance, historian Deborah Gray White argues that myths about black women's lusty availability, set against the gendered expectations of the chaste Victorian era, justified the sexual abuse of enslaved women. Legal scholar Dorothy Roberts describes how, in the 20th century, negative assumptions about black women's sexuality were used to justify their involuntary sterilization. As the women in many focus groups identified, 3 pervasive myths account for the most common forms of misrecognition of black women: sexual promiscuity, emasculating brashness, and mammy-like devotion to domestic concerns of white people. These 3 ideas have long histories in the United States and are drawn from a web of racial and gender stereotypes that also ensnare African American men and implicate white women. They create an interlocking mythology with political implications. Previous scholars have labored to unearth the frightening history of public representation of black women and have carefully traced how the assumptions of hypersexuality, irritating assertiveness, and mammy-like competence infect policymaking. In the next chapter, I describe how these myths affect individual black women as political actors. I cannot tell a clear, casual story, drawing neat arrows from stereotypes to black women's emotional lives to their political choices. African American women are too varied. History is too subjective. And casual interferences are too tenuous for such a simple narrative. Still, it is worth trying to understand the messy human experience of the political world. All right, and that brings us to the end of chapter 1, Crooked Room. So I think what of course stands out, well, I don't know if of course, but for me what stands out is, as we've been reading through this, I've made reference to women, race, and class multiple times, and the book by Angela Davis that we read previously. And in here, the sentence, the sentence is, how African American women feel about their lives and circumstances depends on the meanings they give to them. But those meanings are often socially constructed. Social ideas like race, gender, and class thus have a powerful effect on personal feelings. And so that makes me think of the book Women, Race, and Class, and it puts that book, that whole entire book, the concept of it fits into those couple of sentences well, almost in a way that I had never conceived. And I think that that's one of the things that, again, I've said this before, but how it's good that these books complement each other. Also, the book Medical Apartheid is a book that I plan to read. We plan to read here at some point. I think it's a book that's very important. But as using the health industry as a backdrop, the medical field as the backdrop, Melissa V. Harris Perry points out a lot of things that were very relevant to what took place and what still is currently taking place with the COVID pandemic. And it explains why so many black people were hesitant and are hesitant to trust. And with COVID, you have to trust not only the medical field, but you also have to trust the government. And black people have a storied history of distrust with both of those fields and with both of those industries. And they have that distrust because of the stories that they laid out just there of the experimentation that was done to slaves. They have that distrust because of the experience that Eliza Galley had and China Kai Lee had and that Fannie Lou Hamer had. There has not been a generation of black women that to live in this country that have not been systematically and systemically exploited and violated by the government or the health field in some type of a way. And I think that, again, that's one of the things that's important to understanding also to like electoral politics. Like no matter what the percentage of black women that come out to vote are, there's a large percentage of them that don't come out because they have had negative experiences with the government as black women, because they've had negative experiences with electoral politics as black women, because they come from generations of black women who have had negative experiences with it. There's not a single black person, again, the same thing, there's not a generation of black people that have lived in this country that have had positive experiences with electoral politics. To this day, there are black people who have to deal with the county and the area that they live in and that they go to vote in having longer lines than they have on the other side of town where it's predominantly white people there. They have to deal with a constant actions to subvert their rights to be able to vote in a bunch of Jim Crow-esque ways, as we see these different laws that are passing and these different things that have taken place after the debacle that was the 2020 election. And so I think that, again, when we begin to understand where communities of color sit and exist in this nation and in this country, it's important that we have a full painting of not just not just how things are in this exact moment, but all the things that took place in order for things to get to that place, to that area. I sort of lost my train of thought towards the end of that. All right, but we're going to end this episode here. We will return tomorrow and begin chapter 2, which is entitled Myth. I think that I would say that we have another highlightable section in what we just read, and that would be let me see. All right, so where it says on page 47, right here, how African American women feel about their lives. It's a highlightable section from how African American women feel about their lives all the way to social ideas like race, gender, and class have thus a powerful effect on personal feelings. A good example is African American women attitudes towards doctors, medicine, and healthcare. And I think that just having that sort of makes it speak for itself. Okay, so and then then this sentence here. That was another sentence. To understand black women as political actors, we must explore how intersecting disadvantages based on race, gender, class, and sexuality influence how these women feel and think. Okay. And also this brings me back to Race Matters by Cornel West. And he did a good job of explaining how, as much as it was also important to understand the cultural aspects that exist within this country in an effort to understand the racism that exists and why police terrorism and mass incarceration and all of these things exist and persist. All right, so share this episode on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Again, we put out these episodes on a daily basis to provide you the opportunity to begin or further your journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we will be back tomorrow with chapter 2. We outside.